Okay, hello. My name is Emma Skye, and I'm Director of Yale World Fellows. Thank you for joining us at the Good Society Forum. The Good Society Forum is a community of change makers around the world with a common quest to build the good society. The forum is co-hosted by Nizam Uddin, Senior Head of Mosaic and Community Integration at the Prince's Trust, and a 2019 Yale World Fellow.
Hello, everybody. I am Nizam, and Emma will be calling me Niz, so feel free to call me Niz. We are thrilled to have people from right across the world join us this evening in London and different times across the world as we take this first step in building this community of good society builders. This, of course, is our first webinar as we're doing in this format, so please do bear with us if we have any technical glitches. Hopefully we won't, and it's going to be very smooth sailing. So we are very keen for this to be a building of a community, which means we're very keen to see how we can engage with you throughout. So the first thing I would love to see, if possible, is if this is your first engagement with a forum like this, please raise your hand, and I think we will be able to see you raising your hand on, there we go, we're seeing loads of hands raised. We've got 14, 15, brilliant. And as you're raising your hands, we also want to get a sense of who's with us. So if you could maybe just in the chat function, which me and Emma can see, if you could just put which city you're from in the world, we can get a sense of just who's representing here. Goodness, Princeton, New Haven, we have Beirut,
Brussels, Boston,
Buenos Aires, Washington, Athens, Stockholm, Tunis, Bangkok, Ankara.
Glasgow.
Wow, that's incredible. Hamden. Hi, Norma. I have to say hello to Norma. We have Hong Kong. Goodness, we have the entirety of the time zones around the world. We're so grateful for you to have joined us. We hope that this will be the start of a long conversation. It will not end at the end of this webinar. It's really important for us to note. We have created an opportunity for us to continue these conversations afterwards. The plan, so we have over 50 people and counting in this room already so far. We've had well over a couple of 100 people who've registered an interest. So we're very excited to see what and how this builds and grows. So the plan after this webinar is we're going to create a summary document, which will be a live breathing document of good practice of how people build on the issues that we're talking about. And we're also going to create a Facebook group that will be closed for those who wish to participate in these conversations in this interconnected world that we live in. Over to you, Emma.
So thank you, Niz. Today we're going to be discussing how to counter disinformation about COVID-19. There's so much crazy misinformation out there and all these conspiracy theories. We've got China accusing the US military of creating it. We've got people blaming 5G and blowing up these masts. The Russians are saying it's Bill Gates. President Trump was suggesting injecting with disinfectant to counter it. So our format is going to be to hear from each of our three speakers first, followed by some questions. Now, there's a lot of you, we can see more and more participants coming in. We will try to get to all your questions, but we might not be able to, but we'll do our best in the 1 hour that we've got. But as Niz said, we expect that these conversations are going to continue beyond today. And we've got a Facebook group already set up to enable that.
Fantastic. So we have three guests here with us today, and we will be introducing them as and when they emerge, the beauty of Zoom. We first have Chloe Colliver, Senior Research Manager and Digital Research Unit Lead at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Chloe advises governments and technology companies on responses to online harms from state and non-state networks. She's worked on the development of the Global Internet Forum to counter terrorism with Facebook, Microsoft, Twitter, and Google, and has done a master's degree at Yale, where, who was your teacher again, Chloe?
That was Miss Emma Skye.
There we go. Over to you, Chloe, and me and Emma will disappear as Chloe will share with us some of her work.
Thank you, Niz and Emma, and hello everyone around the world. It's wonderful to see so many different faces virtually around the table. I just wanted to really quickly introduce ISD, the organisation that I'm here representing today, and the kind of work we do before jumping into some of what we've been doing to both understand and try and respond to this swell of mis and disinformation around coronavirus. So ISD is a public charity based in the UK, but we work globally around the world, set up to look at all issues around hate, polarization, and extremism. The reason that we've started more recently in the last 4 years to also look specifically at disinformation is through that intersection of how extremists and hate groups are using disinformation to polarize and divide societies. So that's really the tactical lens that we're looking at this problem through. ISD is what we call a think and do tank, not the term I love, but it tries to describe the fact that we're not just a research body, but we try and do positive and proactive work with the insights that we're able to garner through our online and offline research. So I lead our digital research unit, and that's anything we do looking at how technology and the internet is affecting the phenomena that we're interested in, and also our digital policy, so how governments or tech companies could and should be responding to these kind of threats online. So specifically around coronavirus and disinformation, we have 3 different programs running that I'll touch on today so that we can start a conversation around examples of the threat that we're seeing and then the responses that might be possible. The biggest of those is some work we're doing in the US at the moment, which is geared up to look at disinformation across 2020. And so at the moment is focused very much on COVID-related disinformation. What we're doing there is both a massive research effort across about 12 online platforms simultaneously, and that feeds into work we're doing with civil society groups, with policymakers and experts in the US on a daily basis to inform them about the kind of threats that are coming down the pipeline and how they might best respond to the kind of disinformation campaigns that we're seeing through our research. We're also now gearing up for a similar effort in Europe, but that's particularly looking at the intersection we've started to see of coronavirus disinformation and the anti-migrant hate space. And this is particularly directed at refugees and migrants coming in around the Greek and Turkish borders. So we're going to be doing some work with investigative journalists to understand who is behind some of these disinformation attacks, what their impact on migrant societies might be, and how governments or journalists or civil society groups in the region can respond to that kind of hateful disinformation attack. And then finally, across all of those programs, as we are always, we're trying to think about what to do about this kind of problem. And that really sits in 3 buckets. So one of them is around resilience building and education. What does this crisis tell us about how we need to build resilience, not just in youth communities, but also across the generations in terms of online disinformation? The second is narrative pushback. Are there ways we can engage influencers or those with credible voices in communities to be pushing back on the most dangerous of the disinformation narratives we're seeing around coronavirus? And finally, digital policy. What does this tell us about how government should or shouldn't be regulating tech companies, or how tech companies should be self-regulating in a more effective way to stem potentially harmful information from reaching broader populations? So that's the kind of overview of what we're looking at the moment. And obviously this is a particularly seismic problem this year. What interests me the most, I think, from what we're seeing so far is that it's really a double-edged crisis. So it's a crisis in misinformation, so unintentional sharing of false information. A lot of that is focused on the health side of things, so fake cures or fake symptoms. But then there's also a crisis in disinformation at the same time, the purposeful, intentional sharing of harmful information. That's something that we're quite focused on at the moment. And we've already seen a massive uptick in the adoption of disinformation around coronavirus by known bad actors like extremist groups, both on the Islamist and the far right end of the spectrum. For example, we've seen white nationalist groups in the US take on coronavirus as both a way to threaten minority groups through infection, or also to spread propaganda, for example, about the Second Civil War, or accelerationist discourses about the impending end of humanity. So a lot of exploitation of the coronavirus crisis by known bad actors and groups online. That also is the case for foreign state groups, for example. We've seen China, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and I expect to see a number of other states enter the disinformation game online now that other interests such as oil are also on the table around the crisis. The conspiracy networks we've been looking at are particularly active at the moment, as everyone knows. And the interesting thing we're starting to see in our research is the intersection of political ideological conspiracy networks with health misinformation networks, and how these kind of audiences are being brought together in this crisis with potentially lethal consequences. On Facebook, we've been looking at how the anti-vaccination community has now pivoted towards coronavirus disinformation, and how those ready-made audiences are susceptible to that kind of content. On more fringe platforms, we've been looking at how anti-elitist conspiracy networks are now using those kind of Bill Gates, George Soros, Rothschild conspiracies to target anti-Semitic content more broadly to bigger audiences on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube. We're looking at how the internationalization of these problems is affecting different minority communities. We've seen Hindu nationalists in India take on coronavirus as an excuse to launch anti-Muslim content around COVID-19 and push it against Muslim communities in India. And we've seen that trend arrive now in the United States with the same hashtags, the same phraseology, targeting Muslim communities in the US. Those are a few of the trends we've been seeing, and we've been setting up a kind of new technological infrastructure to try and keep doing this work at scale when there is so much to detect. That includes monitoring of major social media platforms like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Reddit, but also the kind of coordination platforms like Gab, Telegram, or Discord, where we see a lot of these information campaigns coordinated and mobilized and then launched to the wider public. That enables us to have an understanding of how these things can be mainstreamed from very fringe audiences and can manipulate platform products to get that disinformation out to a much wider audience. The only thing I'll touch on now is I thought I wanted to say something about what we haven't seen yet and something that I might be worried about coming in the future as the coronavirus crisis continues. The main thing that keeps me up at night at the moment is thinking about how the disinformation crisis around coronavirus, we haven't yet seen the full effect of that, and that the targeting of minority communities and especially of women and female public figures online hasn't yet really come to the fore. But in every disinformation crisis that we've studied, we've seen disinformation and smear campaigns used as a way to silence and harass public figures, especially from minority backgrounds. And I expect that we see, as the year goes on, that will be a tool that's deployed by bad actors across the internet to try and silence those who are already at a loss. And that silencing will be only more effective when there aren't offline routes of communication and advocacy work that can happen in the current climate. And then on a slightly more positive approach, I just wanted to end really on saying about some of the ideas about how we can start pushing back on some of this. So I mentioned those earlier, but I really think there's a lot of room to think about narrative pushback, which community influencers might have the ability to do the best work to try and stop some of these disinformation campaigns going viral. I'm going to stop there because I see faces appearing on the screen.
Thank you very much, Chloe.
Thank you, Chloe.
No, that was really, really great. Somebody must have taught you well sometime during your university education anyway. So our second guest is Amil Khan. And Amil is a former foreign correspondent who decided that journalism was no longer able to achieve change for those who needed it most. So he went on to help activists and campaigners challenge corrupt regimes. And with the Trump election and the Brexit referendum, he realized that disinformation campaigns were becoming the norm for political communications across the world. So we set up Valent Projects. It's an integrated digital communications agency that helps those who are working to make the world a better place to thrive in the new information environment. Amil.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for that, Emma. I think I was going to do an intro, but I think you've totally cut. So, oh, I'm unmuted now. Can everybody hear me?
We can hear you.
Great. So, yeah, I think maybe it's worth me just saying that what my motivation was around it. I, as a journalist, was always really interested in the idea of how information can lead to positive change, particularly social and political change. And as a journalist who spoke Arabic and worked in the Middle East, my first introduction to this was extremist groups. So Al-Qaeda and the forerunners of ISIS in Iraq, Taliban. And what fascinated me about it, it sort of became my area of specialty, was how insurgent groups were using new technology in the information space, and basically the development of the information environment, because it was developing and evolving, to challenge as existing power, sort of people, the megalith of power that's out there with all of its resources, military or diplomatic or political or financial, and were sort of working around the system, were outflanking it. And I saw that in Iraq, I saw that in places like Afghanistan. And it came to 2000, I left journalism and I ended up working on Syria with Syrian activists and human rights activists who were trying to challenge the regime in Damascus. And it was in 2017, so 2013 first, and then 2017, where we saw, well, basically the regime do a chemical weapons attack, and this technique was used where people like me sitting alongside Syrian friends were seeing in real time this response that was using, on the one hand, ministers and officials and diplomats speaking on TV alongside Russia Today or other outlets, with this really complex online effort as well. And it was all integrated, and it had an outcome, which was, in the case of the American response to the chemical weapons use, it stopped a serious response. It stopped a response that could actually change the course of the war. So it was immensely effective while being immensely cheap, and also having very little in terms of political risk to those who did it. It was a crisis communications, this was a crisis management, crisis communications technique. So I wrote it up, I wrote about it, I wrote articles about it and said, wow, this is a new development in the world of international relations. Then we had the general election in the UK, but we had Brexit as well, and we had the American election, but it was around the time of the UK election, and people might remember, especially if you were in the UK at the time, the story of the little boy who was lying on the floor in a hospital. And I saw a lot of the same techniques being used again. At about the same time, I'd been doing some research on the use of communications in war zones, so still places in the Middle East. And you could see that there were techniques that were now becoming formalized, commercialized, I would say. So whereas before it seemed like it was just sort of this semi-state sort of deniable activity, now it looked like there were actually entities that you could go and ask their service, and they would do that. If anybody's interested, I would point to Valent's research on the use of what they call inauthentic coordinated networks or Facebook groups in Libya, and they talk about it with companies. One was based in the UAE, one was based in Egypt, and they were running networks that you could look at and see what they were doing. Essentially, it was a form of hybrid warfare. So techniques that were being used and developed in not just the Middle East, but in war zones generally, in what we would call, the developing world, were then being used in much more sophisticated political setups, the West, the UK, the US, Europe, elsewhere, and France. And then we've got COVID. So basically, COVID is, as far as I can see, the normalization of disinformation as a crisis communications technique. I think if when the dust settles and we see more research on this, I think we will see that there are systematized services that are being rolled out. And the question really becomes who is doing that and who's paying for it, and who's running it. So the question really for us, and this is what I'm really interested in, and the whole reason why I do what I do with Valent Project, is what do we do about it? My view from experience is that what we see in disinformation is not just a technique, it's not just an issue of how ads are done. It's a holistic problem which is linked to the way our information environment is moving, our demographics are moving, our economics are moving. So we're not going to get it to go away with the wave of a wand or the change of a law. So that means that that activists, campaigners, people on the other side are going to have to think about how they respond to this. And what I've seen so far is that the people who, what we might call malign actors, have been investing in this. They've been very quick to, if we talk about the alt-right, there's a great article in the New York Times about the kind of money that goes into that. And I know there's people on this call who've researched it. What we have to now do, one of the things we were doing during the election, is work with activists, people who are campaigners, even small companies, and say, how do you respond to this? And I think Chloe touched on it a little bit, but it's going to be a multi-pronged approach, multifaceted approach. It's going to involve different types of research, data research, ethnographic research, and it's going to involve creative, it's going to involve ads, targeting, data. We are really far behind on this. We feel this when we go to work with people across the world, that good guys always seem to be starting from a really, really far back position. And one of the reasons for this is funding. There's a lot more funding when we're talking about maybe big companies with lots of money who are looking for a way to manage their reputation. What we have a lot less of are charities who are often supported by governments who, with all their sort of functions, if anyone works in the development sector, they'll know how sort of bureaucratic these are. And there hasn't been a political understanding that these challenges that people face are multifaceted, technical, and are also based in how we think and how we see the world. At the moment, the view is, and I know I'm going to finish now, the view is, I think the ingested view amongst the positive actors is that there's a simple problem we can quickly fix, and if only the tech giants would do this, or only if only government would do that. I think we have to embrace the idea that, no, this is the way the world works, and what we need to do is, if we have to accept that if bad information can be used to provoke and polarize, how do we make good information do the same? And that's a big question. It's got no easy answers, but I think a big part of that is going to be us getting involved, starting, and trial and error. Thank you very much.
Amil, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. I think it's given us a lot of food for thought. And just a reminder to everybody, we will be, in terms of the questions that you put forward, the comments that you put forward, we're really keen to build a community of information as well around good practice in this area. So if there are things that you know happening in your local community or in your country, please do share. We're keen to be sharing that at the end of this. So Amil, thank you so much again. Real good food for thought. We'll have you back in a second. So up next, we have our final guest, George Chen. I'm just going to invite George to join us. George joined Facebook in 2016. It's 1 a.m. It's 1:30 a.m. where George is. So we're so grateful for his participation today. He is head of public policy for Hong Kong and Taiwan at Facebook. He works with the government he works with governments, legislators, and other stakeholders on various policy issues. He's based in Hong Kong. Thank you again, George, for staying up with us. So what's Facebook doing to counter misinformation and disinformation in this COVID period?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for connecting me with the Good Society Forum. Thanks, Emma, for the invitation. Always happy to contribute to the Ward Fellow family. Fantastic topic. I think while I was listening to my fellow panelists' views, I was also looking at the feedback and questions. We can definitely there are some great thoughts in the chat room. We can definitely go through some of the issues and to talk. So let me just share a presentation. I have 1 second. Let me see if I can share the presentation, and then I can just go through the presentation quickly to share the work we do during the coronavirus. Niz, can you and can you see my screen?
We can.
Okay, good. Okay, cool. So I'll quickly go through the deck. I think it's more systematic for me to go through the efforts we made. So I cover Hong Kong, Taiwan. Actually, I also cover Mongolia in terms of public policy work at Facebook. So talking of the work we do about COVID-19 or coronavirus, as you know, there are like 4 pillars we are focusing on. You know, the first one and second one is very much related to what my fellow panelists just talking about. You know, how we can make sure, you know, everyone has the accurate information, you know, as much as possible. And then second point to be complementary to the first point is how to stop the spread of misinformation and harmful content. And then I'll also talk a bit about our work, you know, around the world with the global health authorities, you know, such as WHO, of course, and also how we work with the local governments to support the communities. So to first of all, you know, the coronavirus is something we've never seen before, you know, and then the not just talking about the complexity of the virus, you know, I'm not a medical expert, but also in terms of the quantity of information, you know, people consume every day, you know, that's also, you know, not like anything we experienced before. You know, I'm based in Hong Kong. You know, some of you may know we experienced something called SARS in 2003. But just remind everyone, like back to 2003, the internet was quite different from nowadays. You know, Facebook was even not born back then. So I think the challenges we face, you know, I very much agree with some of the views, you know, our panelists just shared. You know, was pretty unexpected, and we also keep learning through the whole process. So we launched a one-stop resources hub on Facebook app for all of our users. I think many of you, if you use the app, you will definitely see the hub where we try to provide like the sort of the centralized information, the accurate information about coronavirus provided by the credible sources, you know, including the WHO, including other organizations like the CDC in the US, or in Hong Kong, we have the Center for Public Health, CPH, which is our local CDC. And I'm pretty sure you can find the local sources of the official information in your countries when you access the hub. And we also work with the fact checkers around the world to verify misinformation, debunk some of the misinformation. I'll talk a bit further later. So this is the COVID-19 Information Center. I think everyone should be able to find it on your app. And once you click into it, you will find all the the full details. So this part, like people always ask, like how do you guys stop spreading misinformation, not just about the COVID-19, but also about many other things. But I'll say, a large chunk of the work for this part, we have to do this with our independent third-party fact checkers, such as AFP. We have been working with very closely in my part of the world, in the Asia Pacific region. So AFP is a regional partner for Facebook to verify misinformation, not just about COVID-19, but certainly we work far more closely during the COVID-19 period of time. I'll give you some example quickly. And the other thing I think, it's also very important to sort of ban the means channels for monetization by those bad actors to take advantage of the crisis to make money. I think some of you may experience the same problems, in your countries, like the face masks are easily out of stock. And then there are some like bad actors try to do the online schemes. So starting the very early days of the COVID-19, we realized there was a problem. We made a very quick decision to ban all the ads for those medical suppliers to reduce the risk of online schemes for our users. Let me show you, let me get back to the third-party fact checker point. So AFP has a portal. I'll give the links at the end of the presentation so you can dig into that deeper. So basically AFP has been working with us very closely to debunk all those coronavirus mice. This is just a very quick summary of the work they've done, like to debunk some of the rumors and misinformations. As I mentioned, I also cover Mongolia, and then there were like at one point there was rumors spreading about how to cure coronavirus. People say, if you drink vodka, if you drink alcohol, that can sort of kill the virus in the body. And certainly it's not true, but you will be amazed, like common sense is not so common these days. So AIP did a great job in that aspect. So just to provide a bit more additional information about the fact-checking work we do with our partners. So first of all, the fact-checker has to be an independent one, partly because Facebook is not a publisher, it's not we don't want to be the arbiter of the truth. So we have to rely on the local experts and the fact-checkers, who have the capacity and expertise to investigate and debunk those misinformation. And those fact-checkers have to go through a very strict, verification process for themselves. Once they get the qualification from an organization called the IFCN, International Fact-Checking Network. It's also like an international organization, totally independent. And then they can work with the partners, like us, more closely to debunk those news. Once the information was rated as false news, misinformation by our third-party fact-checkers around the world, I think now we have like over 50 fact-checkers around the world to work with us, and then we will label those content published on our platforms as misinformation, and then we will also significantly reduce the spread of the misinformation, which means it will be very, very difficult for you to see those misinformation once they were rated by the fact checker as false news in the news feed. And then my next two slides, I'll talk a bit about our work with the global organization and the local government. Many of you may have already read from the news. We made our donations in different aspects, and we also work with organizations like WHO very closely. Especially for WHO, they basically have the unlimited support from us, in terms of the advertising. This is also a way, like we want to get the right and official information out, sort of as a countermeasure on the misinformation. My colleagues, we have a team called the Data for Good. My colleagues in the Data for Good team also trying to leverage the big data to work with the local governments and international organizations, including a lot of the academics, including in my own experience, we partnered with the Harvard University's Public Health School and the Taiwan's National Tsinghua University to produce a disease prevention map to show where the top 5 high chance places in Taiwan in terms of cities, like from Taipei to like New Taipei City to Hsinchu to Keelung to other cities in Taiwan, like where are the high risk cities in Taiwan for coronavirus spreading. So that was pretty fascinating. Even the government was like, wow, like they can take advantage of those big data research to do the prevention work, even better, and for future research. And last but not least, I think, although today's topic is about misinformation, but we have to have a more overall view of the work, the challenges we face. There's a lot of consequences on the local economy too, and also on the communities. One of the top priorities right now I'm working at is also to look into sort of the post-coronavirus challenges, including mental health, suicide prevention. As many of you, I believe, will agree with me, the sort of the isolation, work from home, or all the schools, including Yale, or shut down these days, de facto shut down basically. So there's a lot of post-coronavirus consequences we try to look into. So this is definitely an unfinished job. And I continue to, keep learning and also hearing from many of you soon. So this is the additional information I want to share, including some of the talking points I just shared. I'll put in the chat room so you guys can quickly click the link. Thank you.
George, thank you so much.
Thank you, George, for that. And I'm just getting a message from my friend Jeff, who says, I'm not on Facebook and I'm never going to be on Facebook. But I think everyone else is on Facebook. And we can see in the chat room, lots of comments coming in. I just want to shout out to Michelle in Brussels, the gang in Bangkok, to Minna, who when I last saw her was in Beirut, and Pat in Doha. So great to have you all writing in the chat. I want to go back to our panelists before we go to questions from the audience. And I want to ask Chloe, do you have any comments you want to add?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. There's been a few questions and comments pop up in the chat that were around the issue of what governments or companies should be doing about this in terms of regulation or policy. I wanted to address that from some work we've been doing around regulation options from democratic governments. So we've been working very closely with the EU, with the UK government, with the Canadian government, the Australian government, on options for regulation around online harms that don't look at the removal of content. So obviously when we're trying to think about how we can produce ideas for regulation structures that aren't censorial and don't rely on governments making decisions about good and bad information, you know, we have to think about outside the box a little bit in terms of models we can look at. But there are some really interesting ideas coming up in the EU and the UK and Canada that look to understand the kind of processes and systems of tech platforms that are affecting harms and democracy, rather than just looking at the content level of individual pieces of truth or falsehood. And that's about trying to ensure oversight and transparency on the way that companies are making decisions about information. So why might it be that, as in the comments we've seen, that disinformation seems to get so much more traction than a lot of the fact checks or a lot of the good information that is out there as well? Are there reasons for that? Do we need to have a regulator go in and have the access to data to understand those kind of systems a bit better, and then potentially to sanction a company or to be able to ask them to fix that? So I think there are some really interesting ideas about how democratic governments can start thinking about their role in protecting our information space from harm, and also ensuring greater transparency from corporate actors around what they're doing in making decisions behind the scenes as well.
Thank you, Chloe. Amil, do you have any extra comments?
I think there's some, just that I don't have an answer to this, but I think there's a really interesting role and
Oh, Amil, I think we're having some trouble with your signal there, Amil. Maybe we can go to George first, Emma?
Sorry, Amil. George?
Yeah, sure, no problem. Yeah, I'm looking at the questions in the chat room. Then maybe I can come back to some of the questions raised. But one thing I do want to highlight, I saw there's a questions about not question about a comment about the Finland model on misinformation. I do very much agree. I think in most cases, you know, we probably focus too much on how to fight against the misinformation. Like when people talk about fight against the misinformation, people's first reaction is how you can take down things, right? Take down things that you think is misinformation. But sometimes we also miss the other side of the story, which is how we can work together to raise the public awareness, improve the media literacy for the audience, especially for the younger generation. So I very much agree. In some countries like Finland or even in Taiwan, I think the government focuses, or it's already like a one step forward to focus on public education on the media literacy. In that space, I think that it has a lot of potential. In addition to the work to direct the dealing with the issue, like taking down, reducing, but I think how to prevent is also equally important to the other side of the war to fight against the misinformation.
Thanks. And Amil, let's try you again.
How's that? Is that any better? Great.
Yeah.
Okay. So briefly, I would say there's two core points here. There's the tech, and allied to that, the legislation, as in what does the legislation say the tech companies should and shouldn't do when it comes to basically, but for example, how do the algorithms promote and provocation and polarization. That's a vital conversation to have, and there needs to be more work on that. But there's something that's missed very often when it comes to misinformation and disinformation. A really key part of the puzzle is the psychology of the audiences. So if you think, let's take it away from the tech side, but if we think about the NRA, the National Rifle Association in America, there's a really good sort of article recently talking about how did this idea of gun ownership become such a divisive thing in the States. And the article pointed to a person who came in as the head of the organization, revamped it, I think in the 50s or 60s, and basically tied gun ownership to the idea of Americanness. Now, if you think that, think of any issue that we have in the world globally, whether it's Islamism, whether it's alt-right, whether it's Brexit, support for Brexit, or the idea that it was on a top 10 issue for people in the UK before the Brexit campaign really kicked off, was something like 14% of people cared really about Brexit. When it became an issue of your identity, of your class identity, of your racial identity, of your political, where are you, where do you fit in the world, and it was packaged in those terms, and the tool used was tech, then it became, the only thing people spoke about, and it became one of the most divisive issues of our era in the UK, with massive implications for international relations. So I think we have to look at that, and we can't do much on the legislation side about psychology, but what we have to do is think there's organizations that are on the other side of that argument need to start thinking about how they get away from exposure. And that was my only issue with questions about media literacy. Any research so far shows that actually, if you tell people that something's wrong, Trump is a great example. If you actually sit people down and do a focus group and say this is actually just totally factually wrong, more often than not, they're more likely to believe it. And that's because it's been packaged in an identity sort of framework, schema, they call it when they look at it from a psychological point of view. And that's amazingly powerful. And when it's supercharged with tech, it's pretty much, unstoppable. But that's the challenge that we face.
Emma, if I can come in now, we've had some brilliant comments and questions on the chat. And I'd like to amalgamate a few of them, and we're not going to be able to get through all of them in the 1 hour slot we have today, but hopefully we can for the next webinar and also on the Facebook group. But I think the first question, maybe to all three panelists, is broadly there's three questions. So the messaging that we do to counter disinformation and hate speech, like fact checks or counter narratives, never manage to get the reach disinformation does. How do you address that? Which then complements a question around suggesting strategies for us to develop counter messages to reach wider audiences. And I think that there's a point there, and I don't know if that's around funding, like Amil has mentioned, or around a passion surplus of disinformation actors, but what can we do to make sure the reach, so I mean, it's instead of being so reactive, so I'm sure there's an element of literacy here, but instead of being so reactive, how do you make sure the campaign and the work that we do in terms of campaigning and countering this has the same reach? Should we try Chloe first?
Sure, yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And we've spent quite a lot of time working with the society groups on counter narratives to hate speech and extremism, trying to figure out, how they can gain the kind of strategic insights they need to do that proactive work a bit more and the strategic thinking around it. I think one of the things we're missing is a broader look at who civil society are and the kind of actors that we should be talking to try and do some of this campaigning work or this pushback work. So I'm thinking here of employers, for example, big companies who actually, in things like the Edelman Trust Barometer, still have a really high level of trust from people that work for them. Are there different kinds of organizations, church groups, labor unions, that we can be thinking about to engage as kind of spokespeople on some of these issues that aren't your traditional grassroots civil society groups who maybe don't have the capacity or maybe the trust outside their immediate communities sometimes to do a lot of that work and make it, I don't know, go viral or to reach the kind of audiences and level of engagement that the disinformation campaigns themselves have. So that's one thing I'd put on the table as something we need to consider, not just in this immediate crisis, but going forward around the way that we do kind of advocacy and communications work on an ongoing basis.
Thanks, Chloe. Amil?
I would say we're at the very early stages of trying to develop a playbook for how you deal with this. And I hesitate in saying a counterflow because that was a phrase used in the world of CVE a lot, and counter narratives. They have a narrative and then we tell you why it doesn't work. I would point to alternative narratives. So there's an example that comes to mind in the US. There was a very clever campaign around marriage equality. So the people who were campaigning in the US to get marriage equality passed as a national sort of legislation couldn't avoid the fact that they had to convince people in highly conservative, socially conservative religious states in the US. They couldn't, as you would do in a normal election, you would just count those people out. You say, right, they're not going to vote for us. We'll go for the people who might vote for us and swing voters. And that was really interesting. So what they did was they did a really, really intense sort of ethnographic research in a particular way with pairings and stuff, as well as data research to look at who were these people that they needed to convince and what was the underlying psychological factor that they needed to get to. So instead of just counting them out and saying they're religious and they're never going to go with this, they went into the root of why they thought that, and they came up with the fact that they thought that people who, gay people lived a non-family friendly lifestyle, and in their mind it was about partying and a hedonistic lifestyle. So they geared and framed their campaigns around family and marriage equality. It's about family, so they should be able to get married and have children, and then the content, the creative side came in behind that and was really cleverly sort of and very truthfully showing that this is about families. People want to get together and have children and live a normal life, and it's not just a silly sort of elite bubble thing. And it works. So it was one of the few times I've seen smaller examples every now and again, when people actually do the research to get into the weeds of why people think the way they do, and then come up with a strategy that works. And if we can start doing that at scale, there's different organizations doing it, there's communities in the way that we're talking about it now, and people can swap from each other and go, oh, that worked here and that worked there, then we will start having a version of what the bad guys have, which is a playbook at the moment.
Well, thank you, George. And I'm going to have just to try and get through a few more questions, because I know we have about 13 minutes left, and if Emma, if she's anything, is prompt. So I don't want to get told off. So George, the question that we have, and this is, I think, broadly a question around government. So there was one question around how do you counter misinformation when it comes to from our very own president? And if we extract that into something a bit broader, how do you and how does Facebook deal with information published by the Chinese government when it comes to, say, COVID-19, and in terms of factual accuracy and data?
Yeah, sure. So I don't think we have any, preference, to person A to B, regardless, the social status or, your job or title or whatsoever. Basically when we look at content, right? We look at the content from two aspects. One, I saw some of the guests, participants mentioned in the chat room already. We have something called the community standards, right? Which is transparent, open to the public. Everyone can go to facebook.com/community standards to learn about our policy stance on not just about the COVID-19 misinformation, but very broad, like hate speech, counterterrorism, safety, everything. So I always say, the community standards is like our, terms of service. When you go to a bank, for example, you want to apply for a credit card, you have to agree to certain terms. Otherwise, you don't need to apply to this bank's credit card. So the community standards serve that purpose in terms of how we regulate the content on our platforms. The other things is the local laws. Of course, we also have to respect, if it's violation of the local laws, and then we have to look into from the legal perspective. So I don't think it's a question about whether he's a politician, whether he's a state head or something. I think some of you may read in the news, we did suspend some information posted by, I don't want to name here, but a foreign state head during the coronavirus time a couple of weeks ago, I think, just to cite as an example. But the other thing I do want to sort of clarify and have emphasis on is this is a very tricky situation, especially for politicians, because they are entitled to expressing their opinions. Sometimes opinions are political speech. It's their like personal opinions. You can rebut them, like on media, publicly. but we also have to respect, everyone's right to express their opinions. Even sometimes you and I may disagree with the person's opinion, but other people will say, yeah, it does make sense. So I think the coronavirus situation in terms of the misinformation and content issues do pose a new interesting challenge or question about like how we can keep a good balance of free expression and how we can have some countermeasure or some misinformation. Regarding the question particularly about the Chinese government, I will say again, it's not just about China or Russia or Iran or any other governments. As long as there are violations of our policy, we will take actions on it. A couple of weeks ago, we took action on some of the content and accounts in Taiwan. There are like more than 60 accounts were taken down in Taiwan because we had a team doing the cybersecurity work. So we connected all the dots and realized all the misinformation that many users see in Taiwan came from one single source, and that single source managed several multiple fake accounts. And this is violation of our policy. So we took down it. But sometimes it's very difficult to determine whether the user or the group is directly associated with a certain foreign government or not. But we have different mechanisms to detect and take actions on those things.
Thank you, George. And Chloe, if I could maybe come to you and get a sense from you of the levels of responsibility between platforms and governments, especially when you have government figures potentially peddling mis or disinformation?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Obviously, it's something that has no easy answer depending on the context. Governments have a responsibility where democratically elected to keep their populations as safe as possible. And I think in this particular context that safety does come to the fore as a concern. And that's not always the case when we're thinking about disinformation, but around coronavirus, it's definitely the case. So I think that governments need to understand what kinds of regulation are on the table that would protect all human rights equally. There is often a false dichotomy set up between freedom of speech and freedom from harassment, persecution, different kinds of harm, as if they're necessarily a binary. That I don't think that is the case. I think it's something that's been used as a kind of excuse not to think about how governments can act a bit in this space. And actually, there are some ways I think that you can try and achieve both at once. It's going to take time, but there's definitely an opportunity to do that. And the EU, with the Digital Services Act, is thinking about that for the next 2 years. But you're right to say that in countries where democratically elected governments don't exist, and that's not something that the population has access to, that companies are kind of the first resort for a lot of people. What I would say there is I would call on companies to have much more transparency around who are the moderators that are in place for different languages, different contexts, what are their expertise areas, how are they making these decisions for people, because they become an arbiter, whether they like it or not, of truth and falsehood or legitimate and illegitimate content. So I think where a company is that bastion and that first resort, there needs to be a lot more transparency on how and why they're making decisions for people in that context.
Thank you. And Amil, I know we've spoken about this in the past. There's a question around your thoughts on countering disinformation with regards to COVID or anything else in a developing context in Africa. And we've had an example of the Ivory Coast and use of Facebook and inability of government to fact check information that's been pushed out. And how does this issue, I guess, emerge in a developing context?
It's a tricky one because so far in the experience that we've seen generally globally, the experience of successfully countering disinformation has a couple of core characteristics that are common. One of them is a coherent narrative, and the other is a coordinated response. And those sound like really simple things, but if you sort of unpack them slightly, a cohesive narrative means that you have to understand where people are coming from. You have to be able to, you have to have a function in the system that goes, okay, who's the audience? Why is it, what do they think? And how do we formulate something that works on their basis rather than ours? That's really, really difficult. Western governments, big organizations, international organizations get that wrong all the time. It's a key function in marketing. Like if you ever speak to a marketer, they'll say this is the first thing that we do. Or the companies that do that with people who've been trained and recruited to do that. So that's difficult for a government like, let's say, you know, in a newly, you know, post-revolution government, particularly like we have in Sudan or somewhere like that, where a government's trying to get on its feet, people who don't have governmental experience, who are coming into the idea of governance and then having to come up with these narratives. I mean, it's difficult. And then on top of that, a coordinated response. So are all your ministers on the same page? And, you know, anybody who's spent any time working with governments would know that, well, that is a really difficult thing, because there might be all sorts of real world reasons why they're all competing. Maybe they're a coalition government of people from different political parties, so you've got a reason like that. Maybe there's personal competition between them. So those two things are really, really difficult to do. But if you can do them well, the example that comes to mind most prominently is the UK government's response to the Skripal poisoning, where there was a real world action and a disinformation campaign all at once, and then a disinformation crisis management campaign. And the British government did a very good job of pushing back against that and saying, and pushing the ball back in the courts of Russia in that case, and actually turning the tables and making it embarrassing. But that is rare. If we're talking about a developing country, that's a really big challenge.
Amil, thank you. So, I mean, we're conscious of time. We have we've had loads of brilliant questions, and I promise everybody who's asked those questions, we're going to try and get them addressed and we're going to continue the conversation beyond this 1 hour. There's one question which I think everybody has 30 seconds to answer, which is, can you give us an example of the trickiest piece of misinformation that you've dealt with? I think it's a good way to end it. So George, can we maybe start with you?
Sure. Again, I think the trickiest to seeing so far during the coronavirus is kind of like political speech. I think, you know, you all can imagine, you know, remember I showed the AFP graphic, like they debunked a lot of the information, such as like drinking vodka can cure the virus, or like, you know, eat an onion can cure the virus. That's easy. That's relatively easy, right? I think once we get the medical expert to confirm that, that's easy. But when an elected official said something that may not sound like a common sense, but it's also difficult to define like what is right or wrong or true or false, that will be very tricky. Like even for the fact checkers, like how can we go back to the elected official to say,
George,
hey,
thank you so much. It's conscious of time because we want to finish on time, but noted. Amil, can we go to you?
I would say I didn't have to deal with it other than in a conversation, but or in the multiple conversations. I was living in Jordan when the American election took place, and Trump was elected. And the most common thing I heard from people was they will not let him win. It is just a big joke to get Hillary Clinton elected, just because they had to put somebody who was completely bonkers instead of Hillary Clinton, and then Hillary Clinton was obviously going to win because that's what they want. And I went back to a few of these people after Trump was elected and said, well, what happened with that theory? And they said, well, obviously they didn't like Hillary Clinton anymore, and then they made Trump win, but they're going to make him fail so that Hillary Clinton can come back with an even bigger majority. And I just thought, what are you going to do?
Thank you so much. Chloe?
Yeah, I think building a bit of both, actually. It's conspiracy theory disinformation, which, you know, at its heart is basically people who feel they don't have agency and control to make a change. And so seeking an explanation that controls everything or explains everything. And the kind of psychology of that is an incredibly intricate thing. And so I don't think we've got the responses and the tools ready. So I'm really worried at the moment about the Wuhan hacks and leaks kind of conspiracy theories around a man-made engineered release of the virus, because there's enough uncertainty about what did happen at the outbreak of the virus to give them kernels of truth to make that run for months and months and months. So that's what I'm keeping an eye on at the moment.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Emma?
Well, I want to say thank you very much to all our panelists and to the audience for joining in. For those who are fasting, Ramadan Kareem, and let's keep this conversation going.
So I've magically got an email address. For those of you who are not on Facebook, info@goodsocietyforum.com. Please contact us. We have this topic is so big and so important that we actually have a secondary version of this in a slightly different way on Wednesday at 6 p.m. London time. Emma, do you want to share with us some of our panelists?
We have got Leonid, who's from the Russian opposition. We have got Rema, who's a policewoman in India. And we may have an African woman minister to be confirmed.
Brilliant. Thank you all so much for joining. We will, in fact, I should have done this bit here, which is add onto this group a link to our Facebook page, which is happening right now. For those of you who are able to join, we would love for you to join.
Niz, you've got to hold it up.
I don't. So me and Emma, Emma's old school. I imagine I'm holding it up. I put a link onto the chat function. Would love for you to join. We're going to carry the conversation on there. Thank you again so much to our panelists for taking time out this afternoon to join us, and wishing you all a lovely rest of your Sunday. Take care.